So inevitably, someone always says that Gnosticism or Gnostic or Gnosis means only knowledge, and that is it. And that is actually false. And the person who I blame for spreading that lie is Zen Garcia. Now, Zen Garcia probably learned from Elaine Pagels, who was a Gnostic author, and she had published a book called The Gnostic Gospels. And Gnosticism, it has been around since before Christianity, but due to the influence of people like Elaine Pagels, a lot of people have been fooled into believing that Gnosticism was the original form of Christianity, and that Gnosticism has no existence before Christianity, before Jesus Christ walked the earth. And Zen Garcia is one of these people who believe such a lie. In his book, he claims that the Gnostic Gospels were passed down by Jesus Christ after his resurrection. And as I have exposed in other videos, that is a lie. But what he also goes on to do is to claim that the Gnostics also do not claim that the God of the Old Testament is Satan. But that can be demonstrated from the text to be a lie, and also other Gnostic speakers, translators of the text, and Gnostic scholars will disagree with him. So what this video will do is prove to those who have any doubt what the true Gnostic doctrine is, and what the true history of Gnosticism is. And this will be straight from the horse's mouth, straight from the Gnostics themselves, not from Christians. So this video is not quite for Christians who are solid in the faith and they're not. But no, it's good for, I think it's probably good for everybody to know. But I just know that some people are sensitive and in their spirit can't handle hearing a lot of let's just say baloney. But for those who can tolerate it, in order to get an understanding of what these people believe and how they deceive, how they infiltrate, and how they twist their own doctrine in order to disguise it as Christian, then this video is for those people who can tolerate it enough to listen to it. So I hope you will be edified by it, and I hope you will be equipped to rebuke those who come with their lies about what Gnosticism is, to try to infiltrate, and hopefully those who are deceived already by Gnosticism will from this be able to walk away from it and from those Gnostic teachers.
True God emanating certain forms that were called the aeons, all of which were pure goodness. But one of these, Sophia, who's also associated with wisdom, fell. She had a fall. And in that fall, out of the true spiritual realm, she created something called the Demiurge. And that Demiurge, in turn, created the world and created human beings. But the Pleroma took pity on human beings and made sure that within us was a divine spark, even though we were lost in the realm of matter, in the realm of the world. And here's the really controversial thing about the Gnostics, and this is why the Christians started burning them at the stake, even though arguably Gnosis was the original form of Christianity. Because the Gnostics say that that entity, who the Old Testament calls Yahweh or Jehovah, he was the Demiurge. They say he's not a real God at all. They say that the real God is far beyond that, and the creature that we've been taught to worship as a God is not God at all. He's some pumped up supernatural entity who wants to be admired and worshipped and adored, and has this huge ego, and enchains human beings as his eternal servants, and created entities called archons, evil angels, to keep mankind in chains. And certain teachers were sent to free us from the control of this demiurge. And one of those entities was Christ. The Gnostics saw Jesus Christ as the greatest Gnostic teacher who was sent to liberate us from the control of the demiurge. And you know, it's true. If you look at the behavior of the church, it's very different from anything that Christ says. Nowhere in the words of Christ, anywhere in the gospel, will you find Christ telling us to burn people at the stake, for example. No way. Christ is a beautiful, beautiful figure who brings true knowledge, true gnosis to the world. And he has, in a sense, been hijacked by the money men and the bureaucrats and the power mongers of the church in a misleading process. And Gnosticism, because it saw this clear, was one of the first victims of that fanatical literalist faction in the church that became the Roman Catholic Church and united with the power of Rome to crush ancient Egypt. The Gnostics were the first to be burnt at the stake in terrible, terrible ways for their beliefs, and went underground. And it's interesting that how the Gnostics take some of the familiar stories from the Bible, and again, this is of course highly heretical material, but we have been taught to believe that in the Garden of Eden the serpent was the bad guy, but for the Gnostics in the Garden of Eden the serpent was actually the good guy. They say that what the serpent is doing is he's saying to mankind, wake up, remember who you are. You have to have knowledge. You have to know the difference between good and evil. You have to be able to make those choices. You can't remain in darkness. This is what the Gnostics say. So they don't see the serpent as an evil figure at all. They see the serpent as bringing the light of gnosis to mankind. And pointing out, the serpent does say in that story, after Adam and Eve have eaten of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, he said, didn't God tell you that you would die if you did this? Yeah, he did tell us that we would die. And did you die? No. What does that make God? That creature that you call God is not a liar.
And supporting, to a degree, the views of Marvin Meyer, as well as overlapping with Karen King and Elaine Pagels, we have another one of the original translators of the Nag Hammadi Library, and this is the Reverend Birger Pearson, author of Ancient Gnosticism. The good professor perhaps takes it further than Meyer from our interview on Aeon Byte number 67, Origins of Gnosticism. Yes, you should download it as well, because like all the rest, it doesn't get better in understanding the greatest of history's heresies.
Okay, why don't we start with the root of everything? What would you say are the origins of Gnosticism?
Well, why don't we back up and ask what it is? Because that's a very debated position right now.
Yes, that was one of my subsequent questions, but go ahead. We'll start right there and work our way down.
Okay, because there are scholars, friends of mine, in fact, who have written sort of nonsensical things about wanting to get rid of the term Gnosticism altogether.
Yeah, that's actually what I was going to ask you. What did you think about this new movement?
Well, I don't approve of it, but in any case, that I think Gnosticism existed and still exists is one of the things I try to show in 362 pages of my book. Okay, so now what are the origins? Well, that's a debated point because, part of the debate about the definition is that, particularly as baldly as Karen King puts it, historians of religion such as myself have set up this category of Gnosticism in order to create a barrier around Orthodox Christianity. Her point is that Gnosticism, what people call Gnosticism, never existed. That, in fact, it's one of the varieties of early Christianity, which has just as a legitimate claim to belief or practice as any other version of Christianity, ancient or modern. So my point is that Gnosticism did not originate as a Christian heresy. Her point is actually what was argued by the ancient church fathers, that the earliest Gnostics known to them were all Christian heretics. This was the standard view until the 19th century, when historians of religion who are interested in the comparative study of Near Eastern and Middle Eastern and Indian and other traditions began to look at the bigger picture and could see that what was described at that time, mainly by early Christian fathers as Gnosticism, looked an awful lot like some of the stuff they were uncovering in ancient Babylonia or ancient Iran or ancient India. As a result of this kind of comparative historical scholarship, it began to be asserted that one could see aspects of Gnostic versions of Christianity that did not appear to be part of original Christianity at all, but had been imported by Christians. And furthermore, that the Gnostic Redeemer, who is essentially the figure who brings heavenly knowledge, or gnosis, to human beings, could appear in all kinds of avatars. The Christians picked the figure of Jesus Christ as their avatar of Gnostic redemption. But in fact, even the most ancient sources that were then available to the 19th century scholars working in the history of religions could see that aspects of what they called Gnosticism certainly did not have Christian origins. The real breakthrough in the study of ancient Gnosticism came with the discovery of manuscripts written in Coptic and preserved in the sands of Egypt. That's where you get the primary evidence that scholars could now use in their comparative philological and historical research to shed credibly new light on that whole question of the origins and, in fact, even the definition of what Gnosticism might be.
In your book, don't you basically say that Gnosticism began, if anything, as a Jewish heresy?
Yes, that's my view, but not only mine, but the view of many other people. This could only become clear, although this was argued in the 19th century already by a Jewish scholar named Moritz Friedlander, who looked upon the Gnostic materials that he could see in the writings of the Church Fathers as essentially Jewish, heretical Judaism. But that was a view that did not capture a good deal of attention and only came back to the fore with the discovery of the Nag Hammadi and other Coptic Gnostic texts, where it becomes abundantly clear that the essential building blocks of Gnostic mythology are reinterpretations of Jewish scriptures, Jewish scripture interpretation, and Jewish traditions.
But isn't Plato extremely important to this growth? Why is that?
The Jewish people in question, who were instrumental in this, essentially what becomes a new religion, were thoroughly imbued with Platonism. From the 1st century BC, metaphysically important Platonism became widespread and influenced a good deal of other cultures, and notably Jewish culture, particularly in the Greek-speaking Jewish diaspora. I say from the 1st century because Platonism, after Plato himself, took on a sort of a skeptical stance in the philosophical school that he founded, the Academy. And it was only with Eudorus of Alexandria and others from the 1st century that a renewed interest in metaphysics and religion appeared in what it by scholars now is called Middle Platonism.
And what characteristics did the Gnostics borrow from Plato?
Basically, with Platonism, you have a metaphysical dualism between the material world and the non-material, the intellectual or the spiritual dimension of, and for Platonists, that's the real reality. The so-called ideas, as this is Plato's term, those spiritual entities of which the material components of the universe are only copies. That is one of the main features of Platonism that Gnosticism took over. However, what the Gnostics did with that basic Platonic dualism was to reinterpret Plato to say that the world as we know it, the material world, is not at all the best of all possible worlds, but in fact is the product of a lower, malicious, or ignorant deity, and that the real deity is beyond this created order and beyond the Creator and the angels that worked with him in creation. Now, here you have in the Gnostic reinterpretation of Plato also the introduction of certain, especially Jewish elements. For example, Philo of Alexandria, first century Jewish philosopher, talks about the angels of God assisting in the creation of human beings, that is their bodily part. And this is something, of course, that comes out of Plato. In Plato's Timaeus, it's the lower gods that are assigned that task of helping the Demiurge to create human bodies. These lower gods become, in Jewish reinterpretation, angels. But in the Gnostic reinterpretation of that Jewish reinterpretation, these angels are not good angels, they're bad angels.
And they also took other characteristics too. I think you mentioned reincarnation, the body being the tomb of the soul, and other...
Yes. Not all Gnostics believe in reincarnation.
And don't you mention too that the word itself, Gnosticism, was used by Plato? What was his context of Gnosticism?
The term Gnosticism was invented in the 17th century. However, it is based on the adjective gnostikos in Greek, and that is an adjective that was used by Plato. Plato referred to a gnostikos type of knowledge or of science as over against other types of knowledge or science. It's only amongst the Gnostics that the term gnostikos comes to be applied to human beings, to people. That is a notion you will not find in any of the Platonist writings.
And did any of the Gnostic sects actually call themselves Gnostics?
Yes. Well, the most notable are the ones that are referred to by St. Irenaeus as the Gnostike Hieresis, or the Gnostic school of thought, and he refers to them as people who refer to themselves as Gnostikoi, people with knowledge. Now, it has been asserted by some scholars, and in this they are actually correct, that the term Gnostikos or Gnosticism, this term itself does not occur in any of the Nag Hammadi or other Coptic writings.
And last but not least, and I do hope you have learned or been reminded like I have on the great constellation that is early Christianity, or Gnosticism, or whatever you want to call it, by our pantheon of angelic intellectuals, we bring in the mighty Robert Price. Bob is the author of Deconstructing Jesus, the incredibly shrinking Son of Man, Inerrant the Wind, the Pre-Nicene Testament, and a herd of many other books. Dude is like the Asimov of Gnostic and Christian and free-thinking studies. I had to end with him because he's just one of my favorite Bible scholars, and I had to include a comic book geek and a Battlestar Galactica fanatic. Yes, it's favoritism, my beloved truth seekers. Please forgive me, and then sue me, and then make sure that Westboro Baptist Church attends my funeral one day. But I doubt you will, after you listen to this very galvanizing excerpt.
Where do you stand on whether the term Gnosticism should be discarded or not? Should we just call them Christians?
That I think is absurd, and she's not the. I don't even know if she said that, but I know Karen King and others say that. If you can't say that we're Gnostics, you can't say there are Presbyterians or Buddhists either. There's always a problem with having a term denote a box into which everything can be neatly stuffed. These names are ideal types, and there's more and less conformity to them. They're coordinates on a map that help us place individual groups. There shouldn't be this anxiety over whether a group is Gnostic or Christian. Like, what are the Mormons? Is Jesus Christ central to their theology, or is Joseph Smith? Well, they kind of both are. It's sort of an ellipse. And you could say, well, I see here a group that's seems like it's evolving from a kind of Christianity to a kind of post-Christianity. Same thing with the Moonies. I don't know why we need to say more than that, but there are some groups that are definitely simply Christian. There's no problem with this, and the same thing with Gnostics. There are, like when, what's his name, Gershom Scholem spoke of Jewish Gnosticism with justification, but others point out, well, there was no anti-cosmic doctrine in this. Well, there isn't, but there's something very equivalent to it in the Calipoth and all the shattered shells of the inferior light in which the divine sparks are imprisoned. That's close enough. I mean, using the Gnostic category sheds light and enables us not only to understand a great deal of it by its conformity to the definition, but to understand what does not conform to it all the better in its lack of conformity. Gee, how come these guys didn't come up with this element that the Valentinians and the Sethians did? So it seems to me to be a grossly mistaken way to approach these debates. Are the categories, are the terms helpful coordinates, helpful yardsticks? And yeah, they sure are. Why worry about whether somebody is or isn't a Gnostic in the pure sense, or a Christian,
And that's about it, and that's more than you'll get anywhere on audio, my beloved truth seekers. It doesn't get better than this in learning about the perennial and most hated heretics in history. And heresy shouldn't be this much fun.